What if everything you believed was true, was a lie? Not a small lie, not a white lie, but the entire foundation of meaning, morality, and purpose that an entire civilization had been standing on for over 1,000 years. That's not a hypothetical. That's exactly what happened. And one man saw it coming before almost anyone else did. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. And whether you've heard of him or not, his ideas are shaping your life right now. Today, we're going to explore who he was, what he actually believed, and why, over a century after his death, the world still can't stop talking about him. Let's get into it. To understand Nietzsche, you have to understand the moment in history he was born into. It's the mid-1800s. Europe is the center of the world. And for over a millennium, that world has been held together by one thing: Christianity. Not just as a religion, as the entire scaffolding of Western civilization, its morality, its laws, its sense of purpose, its answer to the question, why does any of this matter? But now, cracks are forming. Science is advancing. Philosophers are questioning. And the intellectual world is beginning to whisper something terrifying. What if none of it is real? Nietzsche didn't just witness the shift. He stood at the very center of it. And what made him different from most thinkers of his time wasn't just that he saw what was happening. It was that he understood what it meant. And he was scared. Not of God being questioned, but of what would happen to humanity when the answer came back empty. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Saxony, Prussia, what is now Eastern Germany. His childhood on the surface was quiet and ordinary. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was the town's Lutheran pastor. So from the very beginning, young Friedrich was deeply immersed in the Christian faith. But here's where it gets complicated. When Nietzsche was still a young boy, his father, the man who preached about God's love and divine order, was diagnosed with a terminal brain disease. For an entire year, his father suffered horribly. And then he died at just 35 years old. The following year, Nietzsche's younger brother also died. Think about what that does to a child's mind. On one side, you have the teachings of a loving, just God. On the other, you have the brutal, senseless suffering of good people who did nothing wrong. That contradiction, that wound, never fully left him. And you can argue it became the seed of everything he would eventually write. Nietzsche was a brilliant student. He excelled in school, especially in Christian theology. He went on to study at the University of Bonn. And then something happened. He started asking too many questions. After one semester, after being exposed to serious philosophical and historical critiques of Christianity, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He walked away from his faith entirely. It wasn't anger. It wasn't rebellion for its own sake. It was intellectual honesty taken to its most brutal conclusion. From there, he shifted to philology, the study of language and history, at the University of Leipzig. He was so gifted that still in his mid-20s, he was hired as a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, the youngest person ever hired for that position, a record that still stands today. But academia began to feel like a cage. And his health, a combination of genetic ailments and what historians believe was a case of syphilis, was deteriorating. He eventually left his professorship and did something remarkable and unusual for a man of his era. He chose poverty and isolation over comfort and prestige, in the name of something he believed was more important. He chose philosophy. For the next decade or so, Nietzsche lived a largely nomadic, isolated life. He traveled around Europe searching for climates that wouldn't destroy what little health he had left. He settled most often and most famously in the Swiss Alps, where he lived simply, on a small pension from the university. His life was not easy. He endured prolonged illness, a devastating romantic rejection, the slow disintegration of his friendships, and deep, recurring bouts of depression and despair. He walked for hours every day. He thought, and then he wrote. It was during this period that Nietzsche produced his most important and influential works: Human, All Too Human, The Gay Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morals. These weren't just philosophy books. They were detonations, each one a charge, placed beneath the foundations of everything Western civilization had taken for granted. And then there's the line, the one everyone knows, or thinks they know. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? People often hear this and think Nietzsche is celebrating, that he's thrilled, that this is the battle cry of a cheerful atheist who's finally free. He's not. This is a warning, a gut punch of a warning. When Nietzsche says God is dead, he's not making a theological statement. He's making a cultural and psychological one. He's saying the belief system that held Western civilization together, the belief system that gave people a reason to get up in the morning, a code of right and wrong, a sense that their suffering had meaning, that is collapsing. And it's collapsing because of us, because of reason, because of science, because of intellectual honesty. And what comes next? Nietzsche feared, deeply feared, that without something to replace it, humanity would fall into nihilism, into the crushing, paralyzing belief that nothing matters, that life is meaningless, that there is no reason to do anything at all. His entire life's work, from that point on, was about one question: how do we survive this? How does humanity find meaning when the old answers are gone? His first move was radical. He took aim at the very idea of objective truth. There are no facts, only interpretations. Nietzsche argued that all of humanity's attempts to find some universal, absolute capital T truth, some objective meaning out there in the universe, were fundamentally misguided. And more than that, they were harmful. Because that obsessive search for truth beyond us, above us, outside the human experience, it pulls us out of life. It makes us spectators looking for a script instead of participants writing one. So, where should we look for meaning instead? Nietzsche turned to the arts, to music, literature, theater, philosophy, creative expression as a way to communicate and experience something deeper than logic could ever deliver. But even this had its limits. Culture could become commercialized, academic, sterile. Nietzsche saw it happen in real time. And so, he went further. He turned his attention to the individual. This is where we arrive at what is arguably Nietzsche's most famous and most misunderstood concept: the Übermensch, the Overman, sometimes translated as the Superman. He introduced it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and it's important to understand what it actually is before the word gets away from you. The Overman is not a master race. It is not a political ideology. It is an ideal, a personal, individual ideal. Think of it this way: the Overman is the absolute best version of you, not anyone else's best version, yours, a being who has conquered their fears, who has moved beyond the inherited values of their culture, their religion, their upbringing, and has created their own values from scratch. Someone who pursues their own growth, their own greatness, with complete honesty and complete commitment. The Overman is not something you ever actually become, and that's the point. It's the direction, not the destination. It's the North Star you sail toward, knowing you'll never fully arrive, but moving with purpose nonetheless. And underpinning all of this is one of Nietzsche's most foundational ideas: the will to power. The world is the will to power, and nothing besides. Now, before you picture someone trying to dominate others, stop. That's not what he means. The will to power, for Nietzsche, is the fundamental drive in every living thing to grow, to become more, to expand. It's not about power over others. It's about power over yourself. Self-mastery, psychological strength, continuous growth, And the engine of that growth? Suffering. Here is where Nietzsche diverges most sharply from almost every other philosopher of his time. His predecessor, Arthur Schopenhauer, who was a huge influence on the young Nietzsche, argued that suffering should be minimized and avoided. Life hurts, so the goal is to suffer as little as possible. Nietzsche looked at that and said, no. He said that suffering is not the enemy. Meaningless suffering is. And those are two completely different things. The meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay over mankind. If your suffering is pointed toward something, if it's fuel in the engine of growth, of self-overcoming, of becoming more, then it is not a curse. It is the price of becoming something greater. It's what builds you. He called this process self-overcoming. It's a continuous cycle. Dissatisfaction with who you are, the struggle to grow, a new version of yourself, and then dissatisfaction again, because the Overman is never reached. And that tension, that perpetual, productive tension, is the very thing that makes life feel worth living. If we have our own why in life, we shall get along with almost any how. That single line might be the most practical thing Nietzsche ever wrote. But here is the great tragedy at the center of Nietzsche's story. In 1889, at just 44 years old, walking through the streets of Turin, Italy, Nietzsche witnessed a horse being flogged by its owner. He ran to the horse. He threw his arms around it. He wept, and he reportedly whispered, "I understand you. I understand you." And then, one of the most powerful minds in human history went dark. He never recovered. He fell first into madness, then into a catatonic state, and was cared for by his mother and sister until his death in 1900 at the age of 55. Whether the cause was his accumulated physical ailments, a mental collapse, or something else entirely, we don't know. We may never know. What's strangely poetic about that moment with the horse is this. It looked like the opposite of everything Nietzsche preached. Weakness, pity, collapse. But maybe, just maybe, it was the most human thing he ever did. A reminder that behind all the philosophy of power and strength, there was a man who felt things so deeply, it ultimately undid him. During his lifetime, Nietzsche saw almost no success. His books barely sold. He was largely ignored. He died in obscurity. And then the world caught up. His ideas exploded after his death. Philosophers, psychologists, artists, writers, they all found something essential in his work. His words echoed through the 20th century and continue to echo now. Every time someone talks about creating your own meaning, about embracing difficulty as fuel, about not sleepwalking through a life you inherited from someone else, there's Nietzsche. Nietzsche is not without his flaws. His ideas were brutally misappropriated, twisted into ideologies he would have been horrified by. His vision of the Overman can seem cold, even elitist. His dismissal of weakness can feel unforgiving. And his answer to nihilism, create your own meaning, is easier said than done when you're standing in the dark with no light to work by. But perhaps that's the beauty of it. Nietzsche never handed you a rule book. He handed you a mirror. He said, stop looking outside yourself for answers that were never there. Stop waiting for someone to hand you a purpose. Stop living by values you never actually chose, and instead, do the hardest thing there is. Become who you actually are. What does not kill me makes me stronger. One of the most quoted lines of all time, said by a man who was killed, slowly and painfully, by his own mind. But his ideas, they survived. And maybe that, in the end, is exactly the kind of legacy Nietzsche would have wanted. If this video made you think, made you question, or hit differently than you expected, drop a comment below. I want to know what resonated with you. Like if you want more deep dives like this, and subscribe, because we've got a lot more coming. See you in the next one.